Hello, this is Courtney Barriger, your host of Environmental Style Now, the A to Z podcast on all that is sustainable fashion. Back from a long summer break and just in time for fall. And on this episode of ES Now, we are with Dr. Ann Metz, a psychotherapist, researcher, and educator, here to share with us how psychedelics can help you on your journey to become a better steward of the planet. Hi, I'm Courtney Barriger, and on this episode of ES Now, we speak with Dr. Ann Metz. Her work focuses on utilizing the transformative power of psychedelics and non-ordinary states of consciousness for psychological and personal growth. And although she has a KAP practice, she is particularly interested in helping people make the transition from recreational to intentional use of psychedelics. Now let's find out exactly how alternative medicines can bring you closer in relationship to the planet. Well, let's jump right in.
First of all, thank you for what you do. It's super interesting with psychedelics. How did you get started?
Yeah, well, I think I got started with psychedelics as a therapist in the same way I think a lot of people have, which is by reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which came out a couple of years ago. And it was really an eye-opening book that, for me, really highlighted the history of psychedelic use in the therapeutic community. I just really had no idea outside of stories about maybe Timothy Leary and some research in the 60s that it was being used as part of psychotherapy. It was being used to treat a whole different things. And there was a great body of research that really suggested great promise for these medicines. So that's kind of how I got into it. When the pandemic hit, kind of had a lot of time on my hands. And so I just sort of was interested in thinking through what this would look like in terms of incorporate. Weren't a whole lot of obvious avenues to do this. And so I started going to some Zoom meetings in cities on the West Coast for their sort of psychedelic societies, and heard a talk from someone who I think would consider herself an underground guide in Portland, Oregon, on low dose psilocybin journeys. And I just was so impressed with what she had to say. She really had a very nuanced understanding of trauma and of trauma treatment. And I liked that because people that I was hearing maybe didn't have the training and the background or the language around it. And so I emailed her and just was like, do you have an apprenticeship program? And she said yes. And so that's kind of how I got started. So that was really the first treatment the first training that I did was working with her. And since then have gotten, I would say maybe a little bit more legitimate. I did training with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Sciences, and then also did one with ketamine this last year. So that's kind of my training and how I got into it. Yeah.
Wild. Well, what stood out to you when you were studying for yourself as a practitioner, but also just as a human being?
Well, I think that one of the things that is a real paradigm shift from, what I learned when I was in school and kind of what I was practicing as a to heal themselves, and that, often we find ourselves in environments and in relationships where we don't really have the resources to allow that kind of natural movement towards healing to unfold. And so, psychedelics is very much, it's kind of a very mysterious process in a lot of ways of how people kind of move from states of distress and pain into joy and healing. But we sort of trust this inner intelligence that every single person has, which is very different than traditional therapy, where, I really feel like people were coming to me for my expertise you know, this really takes the idea that everybody is kind of an expert in their own experience. So I think that's been one of the coolest parts of it, and it's really required a lot of unlearning on my end as a therapist, but I really like it. And I think it's really a much more humanistic, beautiful process, you know, that really puts people at the center of their own experience.
Out of curiosity, what does the process look like if you have, say, a first-time patient? And let's not even go into why they're there, but what would that kind of feel like for them as they go through?
Yeah, well, you know, I have a couple of different, you know, I'm based in northern New Mexico in Taos. And so a lot of the folks that I work with don't live in Taos. They, you know, elsewhere, they live in California, they live in Colorado. And so a lot of times, what we'll do, they'll reach out to me because they're in therapy usually, or they're, you know, interested in psychedelics and would like to kind of move from there. And so usually we just sort of start with a conversation. We do a couple of sessions of just what we call preparation work, talking about expectations, about intentions, about people's history or experiences with psychedelics, any concerns that they might have. And then, you know, the next phase would be what we would call the sort of dosing session. And usually that's what people would do it kind of in my presence in my office. So folks would, you know, come in for a couple of days at a time, a week, and do what we would call an intensive. And in between that, there would be, you know, opportunities to sort of integrate what was, what came up during their journey, what came up for them, you know, as they were sort of reflecting on it. And then, you know, these dosing days typically last a couple of hours, and then take a break in between. And so that's sort of how it works. And then kind of after the experiential retreat, I would say, you know, there's continuing ongoing care in terms of figuring out how to integrate what it is that you learn, or figure out what the medicine said to you and what that means for your life. So I would say that's generally how it works. I certainly have people who are local, who, you know, are traditional psychotherapy clients who, you know, we do this as part of the work that we do.
That is so interesting. What kind of doses do you work with? Is it super personal, or do you, you know, because for anyone who's not familiar with like the different levels of doses, you know, there's the microdosing and the hero's dose and everything that falls in between. From your experience, like what is the most beneficial for treating, I guess, yeah, like mental health and that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, I think there are a couple of things, a couple considerations. You know, the first is that I'm obviously not the prescriber, and you know, obviously we're talking about ketamine here, which is the only at this point legal psychedelic that we have on the market. So you know, I tend to not make decisions about what dosages are because I'm not the one doing the prescribing. So I have a couple of prescribing partners that I work with. But I would say generally, I prefer what we would call like a psycholytic dose versus a sort of full psychedelic dose. Obviously, you know, I am providing this therapeutic container within the context of a normal therapy relationship. And so it's beneficial to be able to still have some verbal expression. And so it's somewhere, you know, south of what you would think of as a hero's dose, where you probably can't really say much and you certainly can't really move, but certainly higher than microdosing, which, you know, with ketamine, I don't think there's really any research that really supports microdosing of ketamine, and in fact, probably does more harm than good. So yeah, I'm somewhere in between that. I would say kind of a mid-range dose where you would still be able to speak, but certainly there wouldn't be any pressure to speak. I really always encourage clients to stick with their internal experiences and go deeper and, you know, notice what is unfolding inside.
When you talk to your clients and kind of your prepping, I'm curious about how the climate crisis is affecting people's mental health right now. I know that we've gone through some different phases, and I mean, just lately, it is chaotic out there. So how are people coming to you, and is this a treatment that could help, I don't know, potentially bring us a little bit more closer to our heart? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I have always had a real interest in the relationship between climate change and mental health. And, I was trying to do some advocacy work about 3 or 4 years ago. People would just be like, I don't know about that. Do you really think those things are related? And it's just so wonderful now that there is an assumption that, yes, of course, the climate crisis has a big impact on people's mental health. And frankly, I think that climate change impacts every element of our lives, from the careers that we go into, to our choices of whether or not we want to have children, to where we live, to where we can live, beyond. And then there's also the kind of, health consequences of it, that we're living with smoke, we're living with poor drinking water. And these are all things that impact our health and our mental health. And then the kind of more acute trauma of having to experience, or, being the survivor of an incident. You think about the people who are living in Maui right now, and trauma that is, in a sense of loss of place. And so, I think that psychedelics are really wonderful because they allow us to really confront the reality of a situation and not become so overwhelmed by it. It has this nice, a profile, really helping us to sort of stay in self when we're encountering things that are difficult. And I think that for a lot of folks, when we think about the climate crisis, we either, distract ourselves, or we sort of go dark and doom scroll and, just think about all the possible consequences. And so I think that in terms of a treatment, it allows us to acknowledge and to recognize the moment that we're in, the sense of loss, but also to sort of not give in to the despair of it, that it allows us to, I think, have hope and to continue to seek out solutions and push for change, and really try to, it's not going to go away, but, big changes in policy could make a huge difference in terms of what we're looking at 20 years from now. So I do think it is a really a great modality for it. People are talking about more frequently in their counseling. It used to be that I would work with people on the West Coast and it would come up, but it's really started to come up with people on the East Coast as well too. I think the forest and the hurricanes have really impacted people's Still there, Courtney?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Yes, I got the last thing I heard was East Coast and people being impacted, and hurricanes, and it's becoming more less of a bipartisan issue.
Yes. Yes, the people who are in charge are finally getting to sort of see what folks in the West have been doing. So
I myself have not done ketamine, so I wonder about the experience, and if you had a client who was, I guess maybe not even necessarily a trauma survivor of a climate crisis instance, but who has this burden on their soul. What are some techniques that you would kind of lead them through to bring them to a psychedelic therapy, and what are maybe some benefits that you could calculate coming out of it?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is that you don't have to be sick to get better, and I think that certainly applies with psychedelics. I think that the mental health crisis that we're facing right now is, there are many explanations for it, but for me, as I sort of think through it, I think of support us, that don't feed us, that don't offer us a sort of profound sense of meaning. We're kind of living at a time of, you know, natural response, I think, is to feel down, to feel depressed, to feel despondent. And so I think that what's wonderful about psychedelics is that they help us to connect not only to ourselves, but to people in our lives that we love, to the natural world. If you are a spiritual person, to your sort of sense of being, or the sense of spirit. And so I think that even if you don't necessarily fit a diagnosis, there is really something that could be gained.
Well, the experience of taking ketamine and how it, just some hypotheses on what it could make you feel, and the interconnectedness of
Sure. Well, ketamine is not a classical psychedelic, in the sense that it operates a little bit differently, and kind of the experience that people have often is a sort of floaty physical feeling where they'll, we would call it kind of dissociation, where you suddenly are outside of your experience. And dissociation is, of course, a symptom of mental health, and maybe not something that people want to induce. But I think what can be really powerful about it is that it enables you to have a newfound perspective on your own functioning and on your own situation. So suddenly being able to sort of step outside of yourself is one of the things that I think can really be powerful for people. And the other part of it is just, recognizing the interconnection of things, of recognizing that, like, instead of having our bodies be the, building block of all existence, people start to recognize that, maybe it's something else, the sense of consciousness. And maybe that means that they have a feeling that, after they pass away, that their soul will continue on through consciousness. Or maybe it's this sort of sense that, like, that there's a real illusion that we have, that we're all these sort of separate bodies. And people can really start to identify, I think, with what is enduring about them, with their own consciousness or spirit, if you would. And that, that can be a really profound change, in terms of the things that is what starts to matter. And so I think that can be a really meaningful shift. And I think, it's also, this doesn't get a lot of conversation in the therapeutic literature. It's also pleasurable, and it feels good. And for a lot of people who, perhaps have treatment-resistant depression or some other very serious mental illness, the experience of feeling pleasure is a big deal, and it's not something they have a lot of opportunity to enjoy in their day-to-day lives. And so that can be just another piece of it. I won't get into kind of what happens physiologically, but I mean, what's wonderful about ketamine, and to some extent all of the psychedelics, is that they really promote brain growth and developing new neural pathways in the brain. And, when we have new neural pathways, we're able to see things differently. We're able to regulate our nervous system differently. We're able to respond in different ways. And so there are all sorts of just layers subjectively that are at work here that can happen. Yeah, that's kind of what I would say would be some potential mechanisms for change and engagement from psychedelics.
On the level of euphoria, I think there's always this idea that happy people are, it's easier to be more loving when you're happy. And but I mean, just my experiences with mushrooms that I've taken have usually, at the end of it, I do have this feeling of euphoria, and things, it's just easier to be loving. And I feel like in some ways, the opportunity for psychedelics to just kind of bypass, like you said, like this, if you're stuck in depression and you have a chance to just kind of pop on past that, like cross the line very quickly. Yeah, there's just a potential for greater love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's one of the things I really love about doing this therapeutic work, is that, you know, I'm sort of the holder of the space with this, that this person, you know, comes to me and they're very vulnerable, and, you know, I'm there to kind of hold their hand and put a blanket on them and bring them a snack. And there's this whole of receiving care and being vulnerable for clients. But for me as a clinician, really being able to, you know, kind of mothering, I think, is the word that really comes to mind. And I think that can be really profound, particularly for people who maybe have had problematic relationships with caregivers in the past, that it can be just this beautiful way of receiving care from someone who's trustworthy and maintains good boundaries. So I agree, yeah, that when you're feeling good, it is easier to be loving. And when you've experienced love, it's easier to be loving.
Have you seen, like, what are the lasting effects? Let's say 2 weeks after, 1 month after. How long do you usually see patients for? And is there ever a time where where nothing happens?
Yeah, you know, certainly that has happened. Clients where they've, you know, had a fairly decent dose and just kind of didn't have much of an experience, or just kind of had a meh experience. And to me, sometimes that's a little bit more challenging because you have to sort of think through, you know, what could be accounting for that. And, you know, there are a couple of explanations. You know, obviously some people metabolize, you know, drugs differently. And so that can be part of it. But then another part, you know, is that, you know, there is perhaps an element of their psyche that doesn't really want to surrender to the experience. And when I suspect that that is a piece of it, I think that can be really frustrating for people because they're like, oh, I'm here, I really want to do this. But, you know, there's a sort of unconscious part that maybe is unwilling to kind of let go of the reins and kind of give into the experience. And so that certainly has happened. And, you know, I think that when that happens, the best way to handle it is just to sort of slow things down. And, you know, I like to talk about the psyche as having different parts. And, you know, so part of the work would be to go in and, you know, get sign-on from all of the different parts, including the ones that are a little bit resistant to the experience, because, you know, it can be kind of scary thinking through, gosh, what's going to happen next? And, you know, what am I getting myself into? So, yeah. And certainly, you know, the other one, you know, maybe they just need a higher dosage or something like that. But in terms of the good outcomes, you know, I can certainly say that, you know, for a lot of people, this is one of the most profound, meaningful experiences they've ever had in their lives. And, you know, are able to do in, you know, a week of therapy with me, what took them several years to do in traditional talk therapy. I mean, I just think that, the wonderful environment and the circumstances that really support change and really support self-discovery, you know, really, I think are so different than traditional talk therapy. And so I do think it can be a really profound change, and that can happen quickly. And I do think it can be enduring. You know, sometimes ketamine, if I have to be perfectly honest, it's not my favorite of the potential options out there, because I do think there is a way in which it maybe needs a little bit more, you know, occasional maintenance coming back in for a booster dosage. Whereas, you know, I do think the research from psilocybin and the research from MDMA certainly points to the idea that people could have 1 or 2 experiences and it could last through a lifetime. So yeah, kind of having to be a little bit pragmatic about what I do as a, licensed clinician here. But I do think ketamine is really a really powerful and wonderful substance medicine to be using.
Well, I have hope for all of the potentials for treating people legally in the future across the whole country.
Oh man, me too. I can't wait.
It's going to be awesome. I hope I can get my grandmother to take mushrooms.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that would be so great. Yes. Well, send her my way when that happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So aside from just getting everybody high, no, I'm just kidding. No, I'm very curious about our relationship to consumerism and namely fashion, of course, but it's a bit harder to be like, oh, you're going to do psychedelics to treat your consumerism and with fashion. That's a bit too specific, but like, let's just say consumerism. How do you feel that psychedelics could help with that aspect?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know that anyone is coming in to be like, I really want to treat my shopping problem. But I do think that it can be, a wonderful side effect of this work. And I think that, what I think is that when we heal, there's often a sense of wholeness that really emerges within you. And that when you're feeling whole, we're likely to turn to stuff to distract ourselves. And, I think that that's what, a lot of capitalism, liberalism, they don't offer us a very substantive sense of meaning. It's not something that really, we're spiritual beings. I really believe that. And, anything that we do compulsively, whether it's an addiction to a substance or just an addiction to consumerism or stuff, it's ultimately a distraction. And so I think that, a common thing that happens with psychedelics is people start to really identify less with their bodies, and they start to identify more with their connection to others, their connection to nature, their connection to spirit. Truthfully, like, self-transcendence doesn't care what you wear. And when you have a sense of meaning, when you do feel like you're whole, when you do feel like you're loved, when you do have the sense of being enough, the real driving, the fuel kind of falls away that I think drives a lot of us to have stuff and to accumulate, I think there's a message often that is going through people's heads. And certainly I would be the first one to admit that like, I would be more lovable if I had cooler clothes, or if I, had a better car, people would want to be my friends. I mean, we're not necessarily saying that to ourselves, but on some level, I think we are. And when you're able to really have a felt sense of being loved and being whole, stuff doesn't seem like it matters so much. So I think that's a big part of it. And then I also think just, having a greater, deeper connection to nature and being able to really tie our consumerism habits to the environmental impact, and being able to kind of connect those in a meaningful way can also lead to behavior changes as well.
That's beautiful. How do you think, from the designer's standpoint, how could the designer learn from a psychedelic experience?
Yeah, well, I think that psychedelic experiences are really great ways to get through creative blocks. So that's an easy and obvious one. Go in and find out what the medicine has to say to you, and that, there's probably something that's meaningful that you're going to get out of it. But I also think that psychedelics are just a really great way to hone your relationship with your own inner sense of knowing, and your own kind of your own sense of confidence in yourself. And I think that really matters for anybody who's in a creative field. I think it's just really easy when you're creative to feel pressure to bend to what's popular or what seems to sell. And so I think psychedelics can help designers or any creative type really develop a confidence confidence what they have to say in the world, and that that can show up as design and a life more authentically, the way you run your business. So I think there's something to be gained from it. And I do think that it's, again, like one of those ways in which psychedelics, you don't have to be sick to get better. I think that's a great example of how people could really, harness that as a way of enhancing their own creative expression. I certainly have had experiences myself personally where I'm just like, oh man, I wrote a poem and have an idea for a story, just things kind of come up. I would certainly never consider myself a poet or a fiction writer, but I don't know, maybe my inner wisdom wants me to do those things. So
Man, that sounds like a lot of fun, actually. What would you recommend for newbies who are curious but nervous? Maybe they're nervous about having a bad trip. What would be your just introduction?
Yeah, well, I would say, set and setting matter a whole lot. So, you're not going to overdose on mushrooms, obviously, but a bad experience can be really unsettling and traumatizing. So, while they're safe and safer than a lot of substances out there, it's not without risks. And obviously, of course, it's illegal in a lot of places too. So for newbies, I would, say that a guided experience is a really good way to start. I think that what I hope is that people eventually, when these medicines are rescheduled, people would be able to develop their own relationship over time. But I think getting in the habit of using these medicines or these plant medicines for psychological and spiritual growth can be sort of hard when you're either not used to them at all or you're used to using them recreationally. It can be really hard to sort of flip that switch. And so I think that having a psychedelic experience with somebody who's trained can sort of show you what that should look like. And so I would say that's really a good way of, of making it better, particularly if you can do it with somebody that you trust, who's well trained, who's ethical, in terms of things that can help you avoid a bad trip. Watching your dosage can also be a really big thing. I know that everyone kind of, glorifies the hero's dose, but the research really shows that higher than 3 grams of mushrooms, you increase your odds of having a bad experience pretty exponentially, and it goes up and up and up. So I would say if you're new, start low and slow. And that's certainly something I do in my own practice, particularly for people who have not had any exposure, any experience with these substances, which is pretty common. I really like working with that, with folks who have no experience before, just because it's an opportunity to really talk through some of the myths we have, some of the messaging we got around kids and as kids, and to have a positive experience and help people get the most out of it. So I would say those would be my suggestions.
Super cool. I definitely want to send people your way so that they can do it safely and they can be guided. And also, just how beautiful is it to have a trajectory and a purpose behind something that's been, just seen as like a recreational, tool. It's actually a breakthrough tool. So how can I send people to you? Where can they connect with you online?
Sure. Yeah. So I am on my website is Anne, A-N-N-E, Metz, M-E-T-Z, Metz.com. And I'm on Instagram at Dr. all spelled out Metz. So yeah, so those would be 2 ways they can get in touch with me.
Super. And then one last question for you. Do you have any sustainable brands that you love and would recommend?
Yes, I do actually. I would say that my favorite sustainable brand is one called Topo Designs. It's a Colorado brand, and I know the owners really well, and the whole company is just built on having a relationship with nature. And so, they mostly do, I would say, bags, but they do some apparel. And everything is just really well made, and they are really conscientious about fair labor standards. They use responsibly sourced organic cotton, and they do a lot of garment dyeing that results in less water consumption. So it's a really, they've been really intentional about that, and I just really like their brightly colored bags. So that would be my rec.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, I'm definitely going to check them out. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And I'm super inspired by what you do. And I'm definitely going to be considering what my next move is.
Oh, great. Well, Courtney, just stay in touch. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. So,
Absolutely. All right. Have a wonderful day.
take care. Bye.
All right. Bye.
A huge thank you to Dr. Ann Metz. You can book with her on her website, www.annemetz.com, and follow her on her Instagram at Dr. Metz. Now, before I close the program, I want to share with you a special offer that our fashion label Holding Court has for this Black Friday, which is a free gift with purchase. Over $100 of value. If you buy a beautiful Amsa silk dress, you will receive a free scarf of your choice up to $100 in value. So this could be a gift for someone you love or just something to boost your own wardrobe. Thanks for listening, and that's a wrap.
This is Oma for Chicago. Yes Now is a Holding Court production. It is written and directed by Courtney Barriger, with music by Parker Ainsworth, and a special thank you to Alexander Shuck.